Hi there, welcome to another edition of the Commodore 64 Compilation Comparison, and the compilation I'm going to be looking at in this video is Fistful of Fun. This is one of the earliest compilations released for the Commodore 64 back in 1985. It's from Alligata Software, it features 5 games and it had a retail price of $9.95. So, with all that information imparted, let's take a look at it. Let's begin by taking a look at the packaging in more detail. Pretty colourful front cover on this one with the Fistful of Fun logo done in a number of different colours, and you can see the fist bursting out of the packaging there with the names of the 5 games on it. And you can see the games are Loco, Son of Blagger, Guardian, Aztec Tomb Revisited and Haunted House. None of these games I've played before playing this compilation or looking at this compilation, so I'm in for, well, hopefully a treat, but possibly not, we'll see. As you can also see, it says 5 games bursting out in a star there on the right hand side, and the Commodore 64 logo, and the Alligata Software logo at the bottom there. And this is in the clamshell packaging. I didn't mention that, but I do like that kind of packaging generally. The spine is pretty bland looking, just the name of the game and the company publishing it in yellow boxes. So moving on to the back, no further information about the 5 games really, a little bit of information I suppose about each game, but it's also got the instructions just in this box on the back. So no instruction manual inside, it's just got all the instructions there with the keyboard controls and joystick controls mentioned there, with the keys in little yellow boxes where appropriate. A brief description of each game and how to play them, but not a lot of information there. And just to confirm, when we look inside, no instruction manual. It has got the cassette, of course, which has got the 5 games on it. 3 on one side and 2 on the other, I guess, although it's not entirely clear because it's just got the names of or the numbers of the games, 1, 2 and 3 on the left there, 4 and 5 on the right. So I don't know if all 5 are on one side and then repeated on the other side, or if it's got 3 on one side and 2 on the other. One thing I didn't mention that's also mentioned at the bottom here is they advise you to locate the starting point of each program and write down your cassette deck indicated number corresponding to that point. That's a long-winded way of saying write down the tape counter numbers so that you can find the correct position to load a game once you've loaded it once. It does say there it will then be easy to locate the program you require in future loadings. So that's it for the packaging. I quite like the front. The back, I'm not really a big fan of the fact that the instructions are just printed on the back and there's not a lot of info about the game otherwise, or anything like screenshots or anything like that. But this is, as I said, a very early release for a compilation on the Commodore 64. I guess Alligata were just finding their feet on how to present these things, but overall I'd say that's quite average. So with all that in mind, let's now move on and look at the games on this compilation. Before taking a detailed look at the 5 games of this compilation, let's take a look at an advert for it, and this is from the May 1985 edition of Commodore Computing International, not a magazine I'm particularly familiar with, but this is the only one I could find that had an advert for this compilation in it. And as you can see, it's spectacularly yellow, and otherwise it's pretty much a recreation of the front cover of the packaging. But the one thing that particularly stands out was that this compilation was available only for the Commodore 64 and BBC Micro, and there was a completely different selection of games available on the BBC version. Bug Blaster, Growing Pains, 3D Space Raiders, Uncle Claude and Tarzan. This advert also confirms that the compilation retailed at $9.95 on tape and was also available on disc for $11.95, which is pretty good value I would say at that point in time, as a lot of disc games were quite expensive. I also found another advert of sorts for this compilation in a March edition of Home Computing Weekly. As you can see here, they had a special offer of half-price games from Alligata Software, and Fistful of Fun was one of those. This offer seems to give credence to the fact that this compilation was one of the first to be released for the Commodore 64, as it says Alligata was the first company to sell compilation cassettes of its own best-selling programs at premium price, with Fistful of Fun adding to its popular Chartbuster series, so that implies there was a compilation that came out even earlier than this one. 50% off any of these games seems like an attractive offer, but when you consider you could pick up the 5 games on this compilation for just £5, I'm pretty sure that would have been the most popular option. Time to look at the 5 games on the compilation now then, and let's kick things off with Loco. This was originally released in 1984 and is one of 3 games on this compilation programmed by the legendary Tony Crowther. Loco is a horizontally scrolling game where you control a steam train trying to traverse an ever-changing railway track for as long as possible. The upper section of the screen has you looking at your locomotive as it pulls away from a station, and you must blast and destroy the various vehicles that cross your path. Below the main play area is a map of the various tracks that can be driven on, and you can use up or down to change tracks when they intersect. The map also shows the vehicles as they approach you, and you can blow smoke to hit the aerial enemies by holding down the fire button until the smoke reaches the desired height, then letting go to send it across the screen. To destroy any vehicles on the track, you can push right to fire a cannon when they're in range. Aerial vehicles will drop bombs, while the handcarts on the track will just hit you, and being hit by a bomb or enemy causes you to lose a life. Your train has a fuel gauge that decreases as you progress, and when it's empty you'll also lose a life.
Additional fuel can be collected along the route, and the location of the fuel is also shown on the map. Once you reach a station, you're given a flag, and when 5 have been collected, you move on to the next level where the enemy vehicles are more aggressive. Before the game starts, you can select from a number of difficulty levels and also set the speed to slow or fast. I'd heard good things about this game before playing it, and I know that Tony Crowther reused the basic concept in several of his games, so I was expecting this to be decent and I wasn't disappointed. The graphics are very good for this era. There aren't too many colours in use, but the main train sprite is well drawn and the enemies and backgrounds all serve their purpose well. The scrolling is nice and smooth too on both halves of the screen, which is quite impressive. The sound effects are fairly basic, limited to train noises and explosions, but the recreation of Jean-Michel Jarre's famous Equinox is easily recognised and well done for this point in time, and makes a surprisingly good background theme. The clever two-screen design is really challenging, as you'll need to constantly keep an eye on both, which can be quite stressful. On the top half, you'll have to pay attention to the overhead enemies and judge when to dispatch them, while you must also be monitoring the map section and branching at the correct time to keep your fuel topped up, whilst also watching out for the handcarts that can collide with you. They're probably the most annoying thing in the game, as sometimes they can hit you at the very first intersection after you leave the station, and that seems almost unavoidable. Loco may not seem like anything special at first glance, but it's a simple and original idea that's well executed and addictive. With lots of options for changing the speed and difficulty, it also offers replayability and a continued high score challenge. Up next you have the second Tony Crowther game, Son of Blagger. This was also originally released in 1984. In this sequel to 1983's Blagger, the player takes control of Slippery Sid, an espionage agent. His task is to collect a series of keys scattered around a large scrolling play area. Sid must navigate platforms, ladders and other environmental hazards, whilst also avoiding the robots that guard the keys. Once Sid collects all the keys in a section, he can make his way to the next part of the area by going through a doorway. This also acts as a checkpoint. There's a limited amount of time to perform the mission, represented by a diminishing air supply, and Sid loses lives if he falls long distances or hits a robot. Losing a life will see him return to the last checkpoint, and that section of the level will be reset with all the keys needing to be collected again. The graphics in this one are pretty simplistic, with not many colours used and those that are being strange choices, with an abundance of grey and purple. The play area takes up very little space on the screen, but it scrolls well and there's a good variety of enemies and obstacles. The background music is okay for the time, but it does get repetitive, while the sounds are quite basic but do the job. This is very much a Manic Miner style platformer, albeit on a larger scale, where being killed sees you having to start from scratch from the last door you got through. Pixel perfect jumping and precise timing are required, and there are a lot of trial and error leaps of faith that you must make before you can learn how to make progress. It helps that the controls are responsive, but your character has one of those annoying long unstoppable arcing jumps that a lot of these early platformers had. This can frequently result in you realising you've made a mistake, but you can't do anything about it as you leap to your doom. The layout of the play area is imaginative, and the large sprawling level was quite an original idea at the time. The checkpoints after getting through a door are a good feature, but it still gets frustrating being sent back or having to restart the whole game again when you've lost all your lives. Some kind of password system would have given the game more replayability, as every new section you reach needs practice before you can negotiate it and get to the next. As it stands, there are some good ideas here, but overall the game is too infuriating to be worth more than a few plays in one session. On to the third game then, and this is Guardian, which was also originally released in 1984. This is a clone of the famous arcade game Defender, and on the very unlikely chance you don't know how to play it, I'll give a brief explanation. You pilot a spaceship and must protect the humanoids on the mountainous terrain from approaching aliens. You're equipped with two weapons, a rapid fire laser and a limited supply of smart bombs that will vaporise all alien life on screen. Hyperspace can also be used to walk from one part of the planet to another. When landers, the base level enemy, get close to the nearest humanoid, they'll pick them up and make their way to the top of the screen. If you don't shoot them before they reach the top, they'll turn into a more dangerous mutant. If you manage to shoot the lander, the humanoid is released and you must collect it with your ship and return it to the surface. Failure to do this will see the humanoid explode when they hit the ground. If all humanoids are lost, then you're swarmed by enemies and the game becomes incredibly hard. A scanner at the top of the screen shows the location of your ship, enemies and humanoids. This is useful for keeping track of enemies that are approaching you from behind and locating the aliens that have abducted humanoids. Once you've killed all enemies in a level, the next one begins with more dangerous enemies introduced. Bonus points are rewarded for each humanoid saved at the end of each stage. This is a very competent clone of Defender that is possibly a bit harder than the arcade version, which you'll probably know is really hard anyway. All the in-game graphics are accurate recreations of the arcade version, albeit not as vibrant, and your laser has a nice effect where it dissipates as it gets further away. The scrolling is fast and smooth just as in the arcade game, but the sounds are not as impressive. A well implemented radar, high score table and nice title screen round out a polished overall package. You have a choice of playing with keys or joystick, with the keyboard option recreating the complex layout of the arcade control panel. The joystick offers an easier control method and was my preference, but you have to hit keys for the smart bomb and hyperspace, and the split second you take to do so may cost you a life if you're not careful. Defender's not a game I've ever got on with, and this version's no different. As I said, the game's very hard and sometimes enemies are annoyingly difficult to shoot as they seem to dodge up and down as you fire at them. Occasionally the initial enemies can spawn on top of you when a level starts, causing instant loss of life, which is especially annoying if you are making good progress. You can also hit enemies or bullets that you weren't aware of when you change direction. As I've said, this is a pretty good version of the game, and if you like Defender then it's a worthy substitute, but it's just not for me. Next up we have another game that was originally released in 1984, Aztec Tomb Revisited. This is a sequel to the earlier Aztec Tomb adventure, where after finally managing to enter the tomb you discover that all the treasure has been taken and only 1/4 of a seafarer's map remains. You must leave the tomb and locate the other pieces of the map to find the treasure, which will take you around the globe with just £50 in your pocket. The game is a text adventure and the screen's made up of several boxes, including a description of your location, possible directions to move, objects you can see, your inventory, how much money you have and a small picture of your location. You must enter commands with the keyboard to find further information and interact with your surroundings. Long-time subscribers to my channel will know that I don't have much love or patience for text adventures, but I do always try to give them a fair shot. For me, there are 3 things that make a good one: a decent parser that recognises a wide selection of words, a fairly straightforward puzzle that you can solve early on to give you the impetus to continue, and the ability to navigate the game world without fear of being randomly killed without warning. Unfortunately, this game has none of those. The parser is very rudimentary as it doesn't seem to know many of the common words that are used in these games and gives very little feedback on whether your words are recognised or not. A prime example of this is when you get a spade early on, but whenever you try and dig with it, the game asks you why you want to dig and there's no obvious response to this. The biggest issue though is that the parser won't even recognise the single letter versions of the compass directions, meaning you have to laboriously type in north, south, east or west in full every time you want to move. Once you leave the tomb at the start of the game, there are several directions you can go that just lead to traps and an instant death with no real warning, resulting in frequent restarts without having made any progress. There are even cases where you can move into some locations from an adjacent one, but then if you try to go back the opposite way you die, which is just disgraceful. All this makes the game laborious and no fun at all. You can save at any point, but you'd almost need to do it before every single action to get anywhere. Visually it's poor too, with very simplistic graphical representations of locations and quite basic descriptions, all rendered on a horrible cyan background where you type in green text that clashes badly. I tried the game a few times to give it a fair crack of the whip, but never managed to get close to solving any puzzles and ended up getting on a boat that I couldn't work out how to get off again. That was enough for me. Rounding off this compilation is the 3rd game programmed by Tony Crowther, Haunted House, and this was originally released in 1983. The player controls a ghost who has the task of preventing 20 souls from escaping the haunted house. The game begins in a room with 8 doors, with the souls coming out of one of them at random. You must try to capture the souls before they reach the key that sits in the middle of the room and escape to the cellar nearby. If the soul escapes before being captured, the player must follow it into the cellar. The cellar takes the form of a maze, and the aim is to try and capture the souls before they reach the exit door, while avoiding snakes and crashing into the walls. Once 20 souls have been captured, the game's difficulty increases, with bats appearing in the main room and an increase in speed. I think it's a neat idea that you essentially play the bad guy in this game, though the ghost is fairly cute with nice animation. The rest of the graphics are functional at best though, but there are some reasonable jingles and sound effects for the time. The gameplay is very simple, you just have to catch the soul as fast as you can over and over again, and it gets really tedious if it escapes into the cellar with the key and you have to keep navigating the same maze. It's pure luck whether that happens or not, as sometimes it's impossible to reach the soul before it gets the key, depending on which door it comes from. I found it easier to navigate the cellar using the keyboard, as you can move in fixed directions and avoid slipping into the diagonals and hitting the walls, which can happen when you use the joystick. It is kinda stupid that you're a ghost but die when you touch anything solid though. There's not much more I can say about this one. It's a very simple high score challenge game where the difficulty level goes up the longer you last, but it gets boring quickly. It would have been better if the maze in the cellar was random or had doors that open and close to add some variety. To be fair, things like that may happen later in the game, but I got bored before I got past level 2. That brings to an end my look at these 5 mostly underwhelming games, so let's move on to the ratings, and as always I'll begin by rating each game individually and then coming up with an overall compilation score. So firstly, rating the 5 games, and Loco is an imaginative concept that's well programmed and provides an addictive high score challenge with lots of options that increase its longevity. It's a fairly simple game, but it's without doubt the best one on this compilation, and I'm scoring it 7 out of 10. Son of Blagger has a few noteworthy ideas, such as the large scrolling play area and checkpoints that would have made it stand out at the time, but with the need for pixel perfect jumping and every mistake punished mercilessly, it soon gets frustrating, and for that reason I can only score it 5 out of 10. Guardian's a polished arcade clone that plays well, but I'm just not a fan of Defender, so while I think it's a well made game, it's not one I enjoy playing. I'm going to give it 6 out of 10. Aztec 2 Revisited has one of the worst pauses I've ever encountered, an ugly interface and unpredictable death at every turn, which makes one of the worst text adventures I've ever played on the C64, and it's lucky that I'm giving it 3 out of 10. And finally, Haunted House has a nice premise and a main sprite with plenty of character, but the gameplay is too simplistic and it soon becomes boring, so I'm going to give it a score of 4. I'll move on to the overall compilation rating then, and firstly the packaging. Well, I am a fan of clamshell packaging and the front cover is simple but effective, but the instructions printed on the back lack some important information and make for an average look overall. For that reason I'm going to give it 6 out of 10. The score for the 5 games averages out at 5 out of 10, and that plays a big part in the value for money rating. At the time, $9.95 for 5 games would have seemed like great value, but looking at the games now, only a couple of them are worth playing and 2 are well below average. When you consider that the likes of 10 Computer Hits and Arcade Hall of Fame would be released a few months later, this is a poor offering in comparison. It definitely would have been worth a look if you took advantage of that half price offer in Home Computing Weekly, but at full price it's getting a value for money rating of 6 out of 10. Pretty low scores across the board then, and that results of course in an overall score that's also pretty low, 54%, which is one of the worst review scores so far for a full price compilation. I think it has to be said that time hasn't been kind to this one. Back in mid-1985 this would have seemed like a good selection of games for the price, but with the exception of Loco they haven't aged very well, and as a result this is a pretty disappointing collection overall. Of course that's my opinion almost 40 years after it was released, but wouldn't it be interesting to see what the opinion of it was back in 1985? Well, luckily we can do just that, as I found this review of it from a May 1985 edition of Home Computing Weekly. Before looking at the review in detail, it's worth pointing out that there's another compilation reviewed on this page, the infamous Cascade Cassette 50, which I can assure you I'm never going to be looking at in this series. Anyway, let's take a look at the review of Fistful of Fun, and it begins by saying this is overkill, 5 first class games for under £10. They aren't all new, but even if you've got 1 or 2 already, it's still value for money. Well, as I said, I don't think it was great value for money in retrospect, but at the time I don't think you could argue that that statement was true. The review continues with a short write-up of each game, and it describes Loco as compulsive with brilliant graphics and still on sale at $7.95 in its own right. It describes Son of Blagger as having superb smooth scrolling, though judging by the slow motion graceful jumps it's under moon gravity. That's a statement I can get on board with, as I wasn't a fan of the jumping either, and he then goes on to say he's not a fan of the Defender style arcade games, but if you are, Guardian will satisfy all your requirements. Again, can't argue with that one. Aztec 2 Revisited is described as having an interesting variation on presentation, but there's not actually any critique of the game. And finally, Haunted House is described as last on the tape and last in the rating of the 5, with the complaint that there are only 2 stages. The reviewer ends by noting that you need to know exactly where each game starts on the tape, and if you start loading in the middle of the previous game it resets the computer, but to be fair it did say on the packaging that you need to note down the tape counter numbers for each game. The review of the compilation summed up by saying Fistful of Fun is a knockout, which seems a bit contradictory as the reviewer wasn't actually that positive about some of the games, much like myself. They don't have any review scores in this magazine, but instead indicate their satisfaction with the game with the use of a small character at the bottom of the review, and in the case of this one, he looks pretty happy. And to be fair, I don't think that was unreasonable at the time. Let's round this video up as I always do by taking a look at my compilation league table, and you can see that Fistful of Fun has gone in right at the bottom of the full price compilation rankings, 9th place with its score of 54%. And in terms of its placing in the overall compilation rankings when we include budget titles as well, I'm afraid it doesn't even make the grade. That does it for my review of Fistful of Fun, and for me, unfortunately, it was more like just a finger of fun, with only one game really standing out. But what do you guys think? Was I a little bit too harsh on some of these games, or did I get it right? Please leave a comment and let me know what you thought about the compilation and the 5 games contained within it, and if you enjoyed the video, then please give it a like. I'll be back with another Commodore 64 compilation review in the near future, and plenty of other retro gaming content in the meantime, so until then, thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.